Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Ethereum, and we're going to be discussing the ETH Bitcoin valuation. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go ahead and jump in. So, I would like to go through the ETH Bitcoin valuation and just talk about general expectations that I would have for ETH Bitcoin over the next year or so. All right. So we have covered ETH Bitcoin in quite a lot of detail. In fact, the very first video on my channel was talking about ETH Bitcoin in September of 2019. And back then, I said that that was, in fact, the bottom and that we would likely see ETH Bitcoin go up. Now, this past cycle, it became very apparent to me right here that ETH Bitcoin would likely spend a while going down. So I didn't, I was still hoping that it would ultimately go higher, but once we were out into the bear market year, it was April of 2022, and ETH Bitcoin still couldn't be compelled to go any higher, it really did just start to look like ETH Bitcoin was in some type of Wyckoff distribution, just like what Bitcoin USD did, right? Where you have sort of these four peaks, and then you come down here and you get sort of an intermediate low, and then another sort of like double or sort of a 1-2 top. Really, I guess it was just sort of right here. And then the market then bleeds from there. If you're not familiar with what I'm talking about as it relates to Bitcoin USD, just go over here and look at Bitcoin on sort of the daily time frame, and you'll see what I'm talking about. Back in 2021, it had these four tops, right? Sort of an intermediate low, and then another sort of 1-2 top there at the end, and then Bitcoin USD then ended up bleeding for quite a while, right? It then ended up bleeding for a long time. The market just sort of slowly trended down, and then eventually it bottomed out, right? Eventually it bottomed out and was able to make another run. So that was my assumption for ETH Bitcoin, was that it was likely in this Wyckoff distribution where it would then go down to the 0.03 to 0.04 range. Now, we are in the 0.03 to 0.04 range. Right now, ETH Bitcoin is trading at 0.0359. And so what I want to do is I want to really look at what has happened previously to give us an idea of what to expect. All right. So there are three clear cycles that you can look at, and they all look really similar to each other, right? You have your first top here, right? You get your first top in the cycle. You set a low, right? You set a low. You go back up and you see ETH Bitcoin put in a lower high, right? See, we've seen that now here, right? Here and here. And every single cycle, ETH Bitcoin set an intermediate low that acted as support for a while. And it acted as support so long, in fact, that most people thought it would never break below it, right? And if you think back, a lot of people did not think we would ever see ETH Bitcoin trading at the current valuation, but yet here we are. One of the things you'll note is that this is exactly what has happened previously. And one of the things to look at is how far below the range low did ETH Bitcoin go before it found a bottom, okay? So when you look at this range low here, ETH Bitcoin bled about 50% or so, maybe a little more than 50%, and then the low was in. The cycle after that, though, it didn't bleed as much. It only bled from this point, it only bled about 30%. Now, you could argue that one of the reasons it only went down 30% was because this drop here already was a lot more, right? So from this peak down to the intermediate low was about a 56% drop, but this one down here was closer to an 80% drop. So that might explain why the secondary drop below support in 2019 and 2020 wasn't as bad as it was in 2016. It was because a lot of the move a lot of the downside move had already happened. I mean, hell, it had already gone down more than 80% from the high. So now, and what you'll see here, if we overlay, if we get sort of our last little circle, let's make this one green. What you'll notice is that both times, right, ETH Bitcoin did eventually find a bottom, and it built out a support, and then it went up. But there's something you should know. When did ETH Bitcoin go up? Did it go up a lot in the pre-halving year? No. The halving year, right after the structure play took place? No. The major move up that occurred the last couple of cycles occurred in post-halving years, right? So last cycle, you can see that it started here, early January. 2 cycles ago, the major move didn't really start until March of 2017. So you have 2017 and 2021, right? Now, one of the things I've said is that ETH Bitcoin will likely build out a base that it will try to hold as support. Now, let us really hone this in and see what's going on. So far, remember last cycle, 2 cycles ago, it dropped about 50%. Last cycle, it dropped about 30% after that intermediate low was set. So how far down has ETH Bitcoin already gone? Well, it's already gone about 35% down from the intermediate low. So it's actually gone lower than where it went here after it broke down. However, the initial drop wasn't nearly as much, right? It was only 45% or so. It's actually more similar to what you saw in 2016. Okay? So, in this case, it makes sense to say, okay, well, we know there is some type of seasonality associated with ETH Bitcoin, but let's figure it out, right? Let's actually figure it out a little bit more closely. Now, something happened recently that has, a lot of people talking, and that was that our good friend Jerome Powell over at the Federal Reserve came out and said, no QE. No QE for you, right? No QE for you, no QE for me. We're going to continue QT. The reason why that's interesting is because last cycle, we know that ETH Bitcoin bottomed when QE began, right? So it actually bottomed right there precisely when QE began. The cycle before that, you can see that, the balance sheet of the Fed was basically just constant. So it didn't really play a role. But once it started to really go down, once the balance sheet started to go down, that was when ETH Bitcoin really started to go down. When the balance sheet went up, when the balance sheet went up over here, right, you can see that ETH Bitcoin went up. So a lot of people were confused thinking that ETH always outperforms Bitcoin in the bull market. It outperforms Bitcoin in QE bull markets. But in QT bull markets, Bitcoin reigns supreme and Bitcoin dominance goes up. So what I would say is that you got to be open-minded. QE still hasn't started yet. There's always a chance that ETH Bitcoin could go lower. But I also want to draw your attention to another pattern. And that is this one, where after ETH Bitcoin broke down from the intermediate low in 2016, you can see that it had an initial surge back to the bull market support band, found some resistance just beneath it, and then consolidated, and then started to move up in late February, early March. Okay? So it took until nearly the end of Q1 to really get a strong move. All right? Now look at last cycle. After it broke down, it rallied up to the bull market support band, got rejected for a couple of weeks, then went up to it again, got rejected, and ultimately, more or less, formed a double bottom. We've talked a lot about double bottoms and how that's what you want to look for to sort of get these major moves, is to find sort of these double bottoms by alts on their Bitcoin pairs. I don't really consider ETH an alt, but that's what you look for, those double bottoms. You don't always get one, right? Sometimes the market goes up without a double bottom, like it did in 2016. But when they are presented, you don't want to ignore them, right? So if you had waited for a double bottom in 2016, then you got left behind. In 2019 and 2020, you got the double bottom. And look what happened after it, right? ETH Bitcoin went into a fairly nice bull market. So today, the question is well, is it repeating this, right? Is it just kind of coming up to the bull market support band, going down, back up, back down like that? Is that where we are? It's hard to say, but I do think that ETH Bitcoin will go up in 2025. I do. As I said in the last video that I did on ETH Bitcoin, if the low for ETH Bitcoin is not in, then I would expect it to only go slightly lower than it already has. I wouldn't really expect it to go that much lower. I think if you are expecting it to go a lot lower from here, you could be right, but it seems somewhat risky to sort of hope for that, especially with it now at 0.035. And, it's interesting because back when it was at 0.08 and I was saying it was going to go to 0.03 to 0.04, a lot of people didn't believe it. And now that it's down here, it just seems like a lot of people have kind of given up on it. And, in terms of seasonality, this should be expected, right? The negative seasonality for ETH right now should be expected because I want to show you something else. Let's look every year of ETH Bitcoin's history and when did it start to find strength? Okay. 2015, it actually got a double bottom, right? You see it? 2015, double bottom, one in October and December. Okay. But when did it get the double bottom? When? December. And you can see that it didn't really get the big move up until January. So the low, right? The low, especially if you look at it just on a line chart and not the wicks, but just sort of these lows, you can see that December was the time that ETH Bitcoin found that support for the following year. If you go to the cycle, if you go to the year after that, when did ETH Bitcoin bottom? The last week of December, right? The last week of December. If we go to this on a daily time frame, just to actually nail it down and not just sort of say the week, let's see, what day did ETH Bitcoin bottom in 2016? December 28th, right? December 28th. And you can see that it actually did the same thing, maybe that it's doing now, right? Where it gets sort of a bounce, and then it rolls over, puts in the final low. This low here occurred also in December. Nice bounce, final low, and the rest is history. So what do you notice? 2 years in a row, 2015 and 2016, ETH Bitcoin bottomed in December, or at least double bottomed in December. 2015, double bottom in December. 2016, single low in December, and the rest was history. But December was the key. Now look at 2017. When do you think that ETH Bitcoin found a low from when it bounced from? Let's go take a look. December 8th. It seems like there's a theme. What it seems like to me, frankly, is that Ethereum is allergic to December. And for whatever reason, it is stuck in traffic on Struggle Street on its Bitcoin pair in December. I don't know why. Who knows why? That's just the way the market works. ETH is allergic to December. Now, on its Bitcoin pair. Get the USD pair stuff out of here. The Bitcoin pair. 2015, 2016, 2017. Let's create a table so we can keep track. All right, let's create a table. Because it might be easy to lose track with everything just being in December, right? But you have 2015, 2016, 2017. Let's just put them all on here. 2019, 2020, 2021, 2022, 2023, 2024. When did ETH Bitcoin find either its low or a double bottom? Either a low or a double bottom. 2015, December, right? 2016, December. 2017, December. 2017 was right here, right? What about 2018? What are we working with in 2018? Did we get a rally? Yeah. It eventually went lower. And if you're following the current pattern, it made sense. We already had this. We already had this low and then held the low and then it eventually broke down. We already had this one. This already occurred this cycle. But guess when it bottomed? Coincidentally, December 7th, right? December 7th. So back to the drawing board, back to our table. When did it bottom in 2018? Oh, look at that, December. All right. 2019. What's going on in 2019? So in 2019, a low in September. Oh, it changes. But what did we say? Either the low or the double bottom, right? The low or the double bottom. Close enough to a double bottom, right? It's my channel. Get out of here. It's a double bottom. When was it? When was this one? Ooh, change it up a little bit, right? Change it up a little bit. January 8th. January 8th. So now in 2020, ETH was not only allergic to December, but it was also allergic to the first week of January. All right, 2021. This was really it's 2019, right? Like it's, sort of 2019. You have it in December. 2020. Where was it? It technically went into the next year as well, right? It technically went into the next year. So you have 2015 December, 2016 December, 2017 December, 2018 December, 2019, technically January. Technically, it was January of 2020, but this is for the 2019 year. It was for the 2019 downtrend of the ETH Bitcoin ratio. So when did the bottom occur? It was January, but I need to sort of note this, January 2020. Okay, so technically the low was in 2019, but the double bottom was actually in 2020. But hopefully you kind of understand the table. So then in 2020, though, when did the low occur? You can even see there was a rally in November of the halving year, which is exactly what ETH Bitcoin did. And then it went down and put in a lower low. When did it bottom? December 27th. Okay, December 27th. So let's go back over here and put that on there. Now you're back to December. Now let's go look at 2021. Did ETH Bitcoin bounce? Not really. This is when it really started to change some. Okay, because you can see that ETH Bitcoin actually went up in Q4 of 2021. So in 2021, you're not seeing the same pattern, right? You're not really seeing that same pattern. You're seeing it play out a little differently, where it doesn't do that same exact thing, right? So 2021 was different. 2022, you can see that in December, it found a low. It bounced in January, but it was, in fact, a lower high. We also saw some of that stuff, similar cycles as well, where it bottoms in December, but doesn't mean it's the actual low, right? Like, I mean, it did the same thing in 2019, and you guys weren't complaining, right? So it found this low in 2018, bounced, but eventually went lower. So, yes, sometimes it can eventually go lower, but it bounces. It gets that bounce sometimes starting in December. This was December 15th, and then it bounced into the new year, okay? So you could argue, though, that in 2022, it was December. The good news is, while it's not playing out as well as it was previously, we talked about this, right? I mean, we said that ETH Bitcoin is bearish for a long time, right? We said that ETH Bitcoin was bearish and that it was likely just going to go down for a number of years. 2023, look at this. It found this low January and had a nice bounce. Right, this is where everyone said I was wrong, and they laughed, right? And I was wrong about dominance, right? This is on this little wick right here where it went back up. And now you look at it and you're like, well, who cares, right? But that low occurred January of 2024. So you have an interesting pattern, right? Where essentially ETH Bitcoin bottoms out in December or early January. Okay? December or January. We've seen it happen almost every single year. Almost every single year that it's been around. Okay? So, with that in mind, I think to myself, maybe, just maybe, ETH Bitcoin bottoms out sometime between now and January, right? Sometime between now and maybe some part of January. If you look back at, and it could be that the bottom is in, right? You might just get a double bottom. If it does what 2020 did, then you could get a sweep of the prior low. Okay, so that's always possible. Like if you can even overlay the bar pattern here. Right, so if you take a bar pattern and just simply look at what ETH Bitcoin did in sort of late 2020, you can see kind of a very similar move, right? Where it basically rallied up to the bull market support band, almost the exact same move actually. And then it sold off and then it bottomed out late December, early January, and then got a nice move. So what if, right? What if, and bear with me, what if you see some continued weakness by ETH Bitcoin for maybe a few more weeks, maybe 2 to 3 more weeks? Listen, if you're an ETH maxi and you've been watching this thing bleed for 3.5 years, what's a few more weeks, right? What's a few more weeks? So I would argue there's still a chance that it remains weak for the rest of this year and maybe early January. That doesn't mean it has to put in a new low. And it could, but I'm not saying it. The timing the low is impossible, so don't even try to do it. We're just trying to figure out when the train's going to move around, turn around and go back the other way. So I would argue either late December or January. I could see it happening in January. One of the interesting things about January is that it'll be about a year after the spot ETF launch. So I could, you could make the case that after that full year, I mean, it was we talked about before, like when the QQQ launched, a lot of the flows started sort of slow down a full year later. So I wonder if something similar will happen again. Well, maybe not the flow, the price. I don't need to know what the flows exactly did, but the price of QQQ slowed down about 1 year later. So I wouldn't be that surprised to see ETH Bitcoin go up in 2025, right? I wouldn't be that surprised. In fact, I think that should be the base case, is that ETH Bitcoin goes up in 2025. Where it becomes a little problematic is that if you were to take last cycle as sort of the blueprint, I guess sort of the elephant in the room is that, we're calling the bottom on ETH Bitcoin. What about the reality that QE hasn't begun yet? And the next Fed meeting's not till later on in January. And so, is there a chance that ETH Bitcoin just continues to show weakness longer than it normally does? That's not my base case. Like, I'm sort of like fighting myself here because, like, I've said for a long time that it could be until QE returns, but there's a chance that QE returns in January. I guess it depends on what the markets do. All right. I mean, if the markets just keep selling off like this, maybe you will start to get QE in January. But the thing is the macro is great. I'm sure everyone loves the macro. But you could also argue that the chart tells the story and that you don't even need to look at the macro. And the thing about ETH Bitcoin is that if you had no idea about the balance sheet, you had no idea about the unemployment rate, no idea about inflation or the bond market or any of that stuff, if you had no clue about any of it, and you just looked at the ETH Bitcoin chart, what you would come to the conclusion of, or you should, is that it bottoms out in either December or January. And it normally goes up in the post-halving year, 2021, 2017. If you were to look at the monthly RSI of ETH Bitcoin, look where it is, right? I mean, It's 33. I feel like I'm having to make the opposite argument, right? It used to be convincing the ETH maxis that ETH Bitcoin was going to go down. Now I'm trying to convince the Bitcoin maxis that ETH Bitcoin is going to go up next year. It is what it is. I mean, I could be wrong, but what are the chances we look back at this in a year or even 6 months and we're like, oh, that was pretty obvious for anyone who cared to look. If you look at the weekly RSI on ETH Bitcoin, the only thing I'm curious about is last cycle sort of tagged that trend line a third time. So it is possible to see, the RSI sort of bleed back down into early January. It's not entirely impossible for something like that to happen. But again, you don't have to time things perfectly to make money or to make sats, right? You don't. I do think that ETH Bitcoin will, in fact, go up next year. How high? I don't know exactly. Why don't we play around with that? I mean, if you look at sort of the fib retracement, if you assume that 0.031 or 0.032 is the low, then you could easily argue for the 0.618 next year, which would put it back up between 0.06 to 0.07. I kind of think 0.06, 0.07 is a possibility. But there's no guarantee this is the bottom, right? I mean, if the bottom is lower, right, then that's going to bring that down. So where I am right now is I think that ETH Bitcoin is in the process of trying to, form the low, right? Whether it's a single low where it puts in a slightly lower low at the end of the year, early next year, kind of like that, and then goes up, or whether it's a double bottom, I don't know, right? Get off my back. I don't know which one it's going to be, but I do think it's going to be one of those two options. The one thing that I do look at occasionally just to keep myself in check is I look at the ETH market cap divided by the Bitcoin market cap. When you look at it like this, if you argue that it's an oscillator, right, there's always a chance that it still has a little bit further down to go if you want to argue that it's an oscillator. Furthermore, we've talked a lot about Bitcoin dominance throughout the years, right? But you could also look at ETH dominance. And ETH dominance, as I have said many, many, many times, that it is likely going to bottom out at around 9 to 10%, right? Around 9 to 10% is where I would expect ETH dominance to bottom out. It's already gone to 12, okay? Now, I said this back when it was at 20%. So if it bottoms at 11, I don't even want to hear it, okay? But it's already gone to 12. I would expect it to bottom out around 9 to 10, which is not that much further down, all things considered, right? If that seems ridiculous that it could go that low, just remember that in January 2020, it was 7.5%. And 2 years later, it was all the way up at 22%. So a lot can change in a year or two. And in fact, I mean, even from December of 2020, it went from 10%, which is exactly where I'm suggesting it goes, potentially, right here. This was December 2020 going into January 2021. It went from 10% to over 20% in less than a year. So it could happen, right? It certainly could happen that it plays out in that fashion. Now, one of the things that I've struggled with a lot, because I think ETH Bitcoin is either bottomed or really, really close to the bottom. Alt Bitcoin pairs, they never went to their range lows. And I don't know if they have to or not. Historically, I've really thought they would. Obviously, with dominance being at 60% already, it sort of calls that into question. But you could argue that alt Bitcoin pairs have found resistance at this exact same level before, right? Before going down to the range lows. So is there a universe here where ETH Bitcoin just kind of is weak for the next 3 weeks? And because of that weakness, alt Bitcoin pairs show weakness to get back down to the range lows? Possible. It is possible. I would also look, though, they are coming near their bull market support band. So if alt Bitcoin pairs are going to hold support, you would expect them to hold it right around here. Okay. If you look, there was also a spike by alt Bitcoin pairs around this time last year. And you can see that the recent spike just swept the prior high over here from a year ago. You could argue that alt Bitcoin pairs are sort of forming this broadening wedge, right? Where we're basically just chasing one narrative after another, right? Like, oh, it's alt season. Oh no, dominance is going higher. Oh no, it's alt season. Oh, dominance is going higher. Oh no, it's alt season. And it's just kind of chasing one narrative after another. So it really is an interesting market. I think ETH Bitcoin will bottom out within the next month or so, if it hasn't already. One thing to note is that a lot of you people watching are probably more in tune with ETH USD than ETH Bitcoin. I'm a lot better at predicting ETH Bitcoin than ETH USD. And any one of my followers on here could tell you that, okay? A lot better at predicting ETH Bitcoin than ETH USD. But I will say this, if you overlay ETH USD onto this chart, right, if you overlay ETH USD onto the ETH Bitcoin chart, one of the things that you'll notice is that when ETH Bitcoin got this correction right here off the bull market support band and formed the double bottom, it did, what ETH USD also got a little bit of a correction, okay? So maybe that's what's happening, right? It's sort of getting that rejection off the bull market support band, and at the same time, ETH USD is getting a correction as well. But again, I think my skill set is probably better suited for ETH Bitcoin than ETH USD, because I always thought ETH USD would eventually go home before going to new all-time highs, but it certainly appears like I was wrong. I mean, I guess technically ETH USD is not at new highs just yet, but it never made that move. And obviously anything can happen at any given point, but it never made that move. And the reason I talked about it was basically just I thought, 2016 ETH USD had a correction in April, August, and December. Therefore, maybe 2024 will have the same thing, right, where you have sort of a correction in April, August, and December. I had kind of given up on that, honestly. But if the markets continue to correct, then maybe you will see that correction into December. It doesn't have to be a lower low, of course. It could just be a higher low. But maybe it will eventually play out after all. So let's just think about this. Historically, ETH Bitcoin bottoms out in either December or January. It's already December 19th. My guess, ETH stays weak against Bitcoin, probably for the rest of the year. It doesn't mean you can't have a green week, but it probably is going to stay weak for the rest of the year, maybe early January. And then I would expect it to start, ETH Bitcoin to start moving up in 2025. I would, regardless of the direction of Bitcoin USD. So no matter what way Bitcoin USD goes, I think that ETH will go up against Bitcoin. Obviously, ETH USD will be dependent on what Bitcoin USD does. But those are my thoughts on ETH Bitcoin. And if you look here at the ETH Bitcoin valuation and look at it in 2024, it's actually following 2023 quite closely, in fact. Also 2019, fairly closely. If you go look at monthly returns, right? If you look at monthly returns of ETH Bitcoin, you can see that it's mostly just been red. In fact, why don't we just look at quarterly returns of ETH Bitcoin? Look at this. I mean, 2022, Q1 and Q2 were red. Then you had Q3, Q4 were green. The only other quarter that ETH Bitcoin has been green besides the second half of 2022 for the last 3 years was Q2 of 2024. Literally every other quarter has been red. All right, this is what I was hoping to save people from. But what do you notice about 2021? ETH Bitcoin was green. What do you notice about 2017? At least ETH Bitcoin was green in the first half. Okay, it was red in the second half, but then it was, green in 2018 as well. So I would argue, as quarterly returns go, you're probably going to see more green for ETH Bitcoin in 2025 and maybe even early 2026 and less red. This is the way the cycle works. This is the way the cycle has always worked. And my guess is that ETH Bitcoin will start to find strength in Q1 of 2025. That is my guess. I could be wrong. We'll see. Thank you guys for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe, give the video a thumbs up. Again, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.